I don't know about you, but I start just about every day, first things first, by making my to-do list. It's usually scribbled illegibly on a Post-it in the corner of the desk. But to be honest, at the end of the day, there are always at least a few things that go unchecked. And one thing in particular that often remains unchecked at the end of the day is making time for writing. Now, it's not that it's not important to me to be a writer and to make time for this in my life. I'm so dedicated to it that every day I put it on the list. I'm so dedicated that every day I collect quotes and prompts and story ideas, and I even sometimes read books about writing so that when I do write, I'll have lots of ideas and inspiration. I'm so dedicated that every day I'm sure to work on other things and finish all my other pressing commitments so that eventually I'll have lots of time to write. I'm so dedicated that surely one of these days I will begin. One of my favorite authors, Anne Lamott, talks about this, about how hard it is to just sit down every day and put your butt in the chair and write. She says, "The discouraging voices will hound you. This is all piffle," they will say. And they might be right. What you are doing may just be practice, but this is how you're going to get better. Very similarly, some of the best writing advice I ever got was from a teacher who once told me, "Just take a few minutes for now and don't write, but just write what you would write if you were going to write." It's brilliant. I sometimes feel like in all the years and years since I got that advice, I haven't written anything since. But I have written a lot about what I would write if I did. You might call this the practice of practicing, learning how to practice. The problem is that the finished product we might imagine for ourselves can feel so far from where we begin. The person we would like ourselves to be can feel so often too far from the person we wake up to in the mirror. The world, certainly as we would like it to be, can feel impossibly far from the headlines we read every day. The demons of perfectionism show up and they stand in the way of good writing, just as they stand in the way of creative risk-taking in general. And this is a problem because we know that if you want to create a life for yourself that doesn't yet exist, it's going to require some creative risk-taking. And we know that in uncertain and anxious times like these, when the ground is shifting constantly beneath us, just showing up as your best self every day requires setting aside those voices, the discouraging voices that show up, that hound us. And these days, perhaps more than ever, just imagining a world of true justice and equity and compassion, it means setting aside those voices that tell you your efforts are just piffle. When the demons of perfectionism show up like this, I try to at least practice the practicing of showing up for myself and for others. Musicians, we know something about practicing. One of the requirements for all students at the College of Music that I went to in Boston, one of the requirements for all students at the time at least was 4 semesters of ear training. Now, ear training is learning to sight sing the music just by reading the notes on the page and learning to write down the notes just by listening to the song. Now, when I began school, I knew that there were people out there who were capable of this kind of magic, but to me, it seemed like some kind of Harry Potter nonsense. Like, you might as well ask me to show up to class and turn my desk into a toad using a conductor's baton. And I remember the first day of ear training class vividly. There was a nervous silence among us students. Well, among most of us. There was one student who was quite vocal in his nervousness. There was one student who interrupted the teacher in the first few minutes of the very first class on the very first day. He was worried that the class was going to be too advanced for him. He wanted to make it clear that he didn't know a single thing about ear training. The teacher very kindly paused his introductions to respond. He explained that we'd all taken entrance exams and he was sure we'd all been placed in the appropriate class. The teacher tried to continue, but was interrupted again. Well, the man said, but is this like the very lowest class? Because I need to be in like the very lowest class. Now you could tell our poor teacher at this point looked around the room a little sheepishly. He clearly didn't want to answer that, yes, we were a class of the most basic students in the entire school. He kind of stumbled through his answer. Well, it is ear training 101, so it is the lowest. He thought for a moment and said, there is, I guess, a class for people that have previously failed the 101, but you all are just about the lowest. Now, some of the students, of course, giggled a little bit at this man's anxieties, but I was secretly glad to hear that at least someone was questioning what felt to me like the absurd notion that sight singing was even something that could be taught. I don't know what happened next for that other student, but he never came back to our class. Not because anything we did on that first day was too hard for him, I'm sure of that, but I think he must have lacked a belief that improvement was even possible. I kept going, though, thinking that if generations of students have done this before me, it must be possible somehow, even though I personally couldn't see the way forward. And I passed. I never became great at it, but I made it through. And I was never brilliant at it, but I at least made a commitment to practice. I've always remembered this other student, though. I think of him surprisingly often, the student who gave up before he started. Similarly, it's not just that he didn't try to become a great master at ear training, but that he didn't even try the practicing of it, which always struck me as the real loss. When the discouraging voices hound me, I sometimes think of him, and I remind myself that maybe for now the work I'm doing, just for now at least, is just practice. And practice is how I'm going to get better. These last 2 years of a global pandemic have been a difficult time, to be sure, a time of constant adaptation, of the ground beneath us shifting constantly. And I imagine that the next year or two, much like the previous ones, will continue to be times of learning and relearning new ways of being together, of organizing our days differently all over again, of organizing our people differently all over again. But times of change are times of possibility. Times of adaptation and crisis can also be times of imagination. And I believe that this is a good time to call on those in power, which in some ways is all of us, to learn some new skills, to practice some new ways of being. And I want to say, particularly for white folks, I think this is a time to play some new roles in our communities. A time for listening in deeper ways we haven't always done so well, and having some hard conversations I know that I have not practiced enough yet. Fellow white folks, if you hear people of color making demands, those leading the Poor People's Campaign perhaps in particular, now is the time to practice amplifying those voices that fight to be heard elsewhere. If you've inherited wealth that was accumulated in a time of systematic racial segregation in this country, which is true of all wealth in this country, now is the time to practice giving it away. If your muscle memory has been to call the police when something seems wrong, now is a good time to practice something different, learning new skills and new practices for community safety. I won't suddenly do all of these things, but I will practice the doing of them. Musicians, we know as well as anyone that muscle memory is very real. We know that consistent practicing changes the very structure of our brains, rewiring our circuitry, forging new connections and new possibilities. Music, no one is born a musician. Musicians are just the ones that learned how to practice. Even songbirds need elder birds to sing to them and teach them their melodies. They're not born with it. It's practice. Practice doesn't make music perfect, but it's what makes music possible. And so let us together show up for ourselves and others to build that world of justice and equity. Let us together practice the practicing. Practice won't make the world perfect, but it makes a better world possible. Someday I want to be a true expert of justice and compassion. Someday I want to be well practiced at creating that brave space even when there's no such thing as safe space. Someday I want to be masterful at amplifying the voices that fight to be heard elsewhere, and I want to be skillful at speaking more truth and more love. Someday I want to be part of transforming a so-called justice system that has hurt so many. Someday I want to be part of transforming a culture of guns and violence in this country that has hurt so many. Someday I want to be part of transforming an energy sector that has been working overtime to overheat our planet. These are daunting tasks, overwhelming tasks to be sure. And on most days, learning to transcribe a symphony by ear seems more manageable than any one of these. But that's okay, because for now, I don't have to do all of them. I just need to practice doing what I would do if I were doing them. So, beloveds, don't promise to be your best self today in this time of uncertainty and anxiety, this time of change and difficulty. Don't promise to be your best self. Just be the person you would be if you were practicing being your best self. Don't try to rebuild a new world in the image of love this week. Just practice doing what you would do if you had committed to such things. You have the right to start somewhere and continue to grow. We all have the responsibility to examine what we think we know. And so let us start together. Let us grow together. And may we practice together. Blessed be.